Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine Cuba's worsening fuel crisis and the growing risk of unrest as pressure from the United States continues to increase. We also look at escalating nationwide protests in Bolivia and a targeted state of emergency in Belize following rising gang violence. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we assess large-scale Nakba Day demonstrations expected across Western Europe, a nationwide strike in Italy linked to the Gaza conflict, and signs that Russia may be preparing for renewed summer offensives in Ukraine, despite recent ceasefire messaging. We also examine rising tensions between the United States and Iran following renewed maritime strikes, the risk of major unrest in Somalia, escalating violence in eastern DRC, and severe flooding across South Africa. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover a major militant attack in Pakistan that could undermine peace talks with Afghanistan, alongside post-election unrest in India's West Bengal state. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where worsening fuel shortages in Cuba are increasing pressure on the government and driving further unrest. On May 13th, Cuban state-run media published an interview with Energy Minister Vicente de la O. Levy. In it, he stated that the country had run out of diesel and fuel oil. He also described the energy system as being in a critical condition due to the ongoing U.S. oil blockade. That blockade has been in place since early January 2026, when U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, depriving Cuba of its main fuel provider. At present, major cities such as Havana are experiencing up to 20 hours a day without power. Since late 2025, only one large tanker has reached Cuba. As a result, the fuel shortage has forced the country to rely on local oil, which is both limited in supply and of inferior quality. The interview's release coincided with renewed offers from the U.S. State Department to provide $100 million in aid in exchange for what it described as meaningful reforms to Cuba's communist system, in coordination with the Catholic Church. At the same time, Washington has continued to increase pressure on the Cuban government. In early May, it imposed a new wave of sanctions targeting Cuban officials. U.S. media have also reported an increase in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance flights off the coast of Cuba. This is a pattern that was also observed prior to U.S. operations to capture President Maduro. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The ongoing blockade has almost certainly severely weakened the Cuban government. It is contributing to growing discontent, civil unrest, and other forms of opposition. Protests, which have historically been rare due to the threat of violent police repression, have increased in both volume and frequency. Demonstrations were reported in Havana as recently as May 13th. So far, the Cuban government has refrained from forcefully quashing the unrest. It is likely assessing that such an approach would be counterproductive and could trigger further protests. U.S. officials will almost certainly continue to apply maximum pressure on the Cuban government, likely aiming to extract concessions such as a leadership change and the implementation of political and economic reforms. U.S. media have noted that the increase in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance flights has been widely reported. The aircraft involved have generally been broadcasting on their transponders, making their presence visible. In addition to collecting intelligence on Cuban military assets and other potential high-value targets, the visibility of these operations is highly likely intended as strategic messaging directed at Cuba, as well as at key allies such as Russia and China. U.S. officials likely assess that sustained economic pressure, the threat of military action, and the increased sanctioning of Cuban political elites could help create fractures within the leadership. This could potentially empower figures who are more amenable to a negotiated settlement with Washington. However, the Cuban leadership has spent decades attempting to coup-proof the system. It has built deep institutional ties between the Cuban Communist Party and the military, established parallel security structures, and provided economic incentives to elites to secure their loyalty. With the blockade highly likely to continue in the short term, unless Havana agrees to significant concessions, episodes of civil unrest are likely to increase in both frequency and scale. Havana, Santiago de Cuba, and other major cities are expected to remain the primary centers for large-scale protests. Given the current instability of the Cuban political system and the severity of the economic pressures, there is a realistic possibility that protests will become increasingly violent. Also in the region, Belize has implemented a targeted state of emergency in response to rising gang violence in parts of Belize City. On May 8th, the government of Belize officially declared a state of public emergency across several areas of Belize City and parts of the wider Belize district. The proclamation was signed by Governor-General Dame Froilat Salam. It stated that the emergency measures were being introduced in response to threats to public safety linked to criminal activity and increased violence. The state of emergency applies to multiple areas on both the south side and north side of Belize City. It also covers sections of Belize rural. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Authorities in Belize, including Police Commissioner Dr. Richard Rosado, have indicated that the state of emergency will be limited in both scope and duration. Rosado stated that the measures are primarily aimed at targeting known or suspected gang members linked to recent violent incidents based on intelligence assessments. It is not intended as a broader campaign likely to cause significant disruption to routine business operations, tourism activity, or freedom of movement. Responsibility for implementing and enforcing the state of emergency will rest with the Gang Intelligence, Investigation, and Interdiction Unit. This unit was formed in 2021 to replace the disbanded Gang Suppression Unit. This arrangement likely means that ordinary police units will not be tasked with enforcing the measures. As a result, the likelihood of widespread disruption or abuse of civil liberties is likely to be limited compared with other states of emergency implemented elsewhere in the region. However, the implementation of emergency powers is likely to result in increased security force deployments, enhanced stop and search activity, checkpoints, and short-notice movement restrictions within the affected districts. These measures are particularly likely in parts of Belize City that have experienced a significant rise in gang violence. The situation has prompted official warnings to travellers from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as from Global Affairs Canada. Both advise against non-essential travel to Southside Belize City due to gang-related violence. The state of emergency is set to last at least 30 days. However, it will be subject to review and potential extension by the National Assembly if security assessments indicate that the threat environment has not sufficiently improved. States of emergency introduced in recent years have typically been extended. Even so, they have generally remained time-limited and geographically focused. The longest recent example lasted approximately 90 days following consecutive extensions. The current measures are likely to remain intelligence-led and targeted, aimed at disrupting gang activity and detaining key suspects. They are unlikely to evolve into a broader nationwide emergency of the kind increasingly observed in parts of Central America. And in Bolivia, protests against fuel subsidy cuts have evolved into a wider anti-government movement, resulting in major disruption and violent unrest. A nationwide protest movement against President Rodrigo Paz has continued to escalate and, as of May 13th, now includes labor unions, indigenous organizations, teachers, miners, transport workers, healthcare staff, and agricultural groups. On May 11th, the La Paz bus terminal reported that the scale of disruption caused by roadblocks had forced the suspension of all domestic and international departures from the administrative capital's main terminal. On May 12th, police stated that protesters, including farmers, indigenous groups, and teachers, had established at least 67 roadblocks nationwide. At least 50 of these were in the La Paz department. A major drivers' union also instructed its affiliates to join blockades across the department. Also, on May 12th, the Bolivian Workers' Central Union, the country's largest union, announced that it had begun an indefinite national strike after accusing the Paz administration of failing to address its demands. Anti-government demonstrations in La Paz and neighboring El Alto have led to police deploying tear gas against protesters. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The current protest movement in Bolivia has almost certainly evolved into a large-scale challenge to President Paz's government. This is reflected in the growing participation of civil society actors, trade unions, and other segments of Bolivian society. At the same time, the drivers of unrest have likely expanded in scope. The initial demonstrations were a direct response to fuel subsidy cuts. However, they are now increasingly driven by broader socio-economic grievances. These include inflation, fuel shortages, wage and pension demands, opposition to the government's wider reform agenda, and calls for the president to resign. The scale of the roadblocks and the disruption associated with them has already likely led to significant shortages and rising prices. These conditions are likely to further exacerbate the protests in the short term. On May 10th, the central government ordered the Bolivian Air Force to establish an air bridge to guarantee food supplies to La Paz, a metropolitan area of approximately 2 million people. This followed supply difficulties caused by road blockades in the highlands. As part of these efforts, 10,000 kilograms of chicken were transported to an air base in El Alto before being distributed to supply centers in the capital. However, President Paz has consistently defended the suspension of fuel subsidies and other fiscal cuts as necessary for Bolivia's economic stabilization. He has argued that fuel subsidies alone were costing the central government $10 million a day, benefiting fuel smugglers and worsening the country's dollar shortage. Paz and his Christian Democratic Party have introduced a series of follow-up measures, including increases to the minimum wage. However, these steps have not offset the impact of higher fuel costs. They are also unlikely to appease the millions of Bolivians who regard the incumbent government as illegitimate, following its victory in the 2025 election after the collapse and fragmentation of the long-dominant movement towards socialism. With President Paz unlikely to resign or offer major concessions, and with shortages of fuel, food, and other essential goods likely to worsen as roadblocks persist, the protest movement is likely to continue escalating in the short term. Fuel price increases are also likely to be compounded by the Iran war, adding further pressure. This trajectory is likely to prompt the increased deployment of police and military forces, either to dismantle roadblocks or to prevent protesters from accessing central government buildings. Such measures would increase the risk of violent clashes, casualties, and property damage, particularly in La Paz, El Alto, and along key interdepartmental routes. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Nakba Day commemorations are expected to trigger large-scale demonstrations across major cities in Western Europe. The 78th anniversary of the Nakba falls on May 15, 2026. The Arabic term Nakba, meaning catastrophe, refers to the mass displacement of Palestinians following the 1947 to 1949 conflict. The Nakba remains central to the formation of Palestinian identity. It continues to shape political perspectives and activism in support of Palestine around the world. Large-scale Nakba Day protests have become more frequent across Europe and North America. Since the outbreak of the war in Gaza in 2023, they have also increasingly been organized in East Asia and Oceania. During the 2025 anniversary, protests in some European capitals drew crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands. In London, commemorations were attended by an estimated 500,000 people, according to some assessments. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. In 2026, Nakba Day will almost certainly coincide with large-scale protests in major urban centers across North America, Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of the Asia-Pacific region. The largest demonstrations are likely to take place in Western Europe. The ongoing but contested ceasefire in Gaza is unlikely to reduce either the volume of protests or overall attendance compared with 2025. Instead, there is a realistic possibility that the 2026 demonstrations will exceed the scale seen last year. Developments likely to drive large-scale Nakba Day protests in 2026 include the ongoing Iran conflict, the continuing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, expanded operations in the West Bank, and the resumption of high-intensity conflict in Lebanon. Protests are particularly likely to take place in high-visibility areas of city centers, especially near government offices, Israeli and U.S. embassies, and other diplomatic premises such as consulates. In addition, previous pro-Palestine demonstrations have targeted businesses with links to Israel, or those accused of directly or indirectly supporting the Israeli war effort, including insurance companies. Universities are also highly likely to emerge as particular hotspots for civil unrest. While most demonstrations are likely to remain peaceful, there is a credible threat of violence in connection with the protests. In previous years, pro-Palestine demonstrations have led to clashes between attendees and responding police. Counter-demonstrations by pro-Israel activists often take place on symbolically significant dates, creating an additional risk of confrontation between opposing groups. This risk is often mitigated by large-scale police deployments. In London, this year's protest is set to coincide with a far-right Unite the Kingdom rally. This overlap is likely to increase the risk of localized disorder, particularly in areas where opposing groups may converge, such as transport hubs and along protest routes. Staying in the region, a nationwide strike in Italy linked to the Gaza conflict is likely to result in major transport disruption and widespread demonstrations. The Unione Sindacale di Bas, one of Italy's largest multi-sector labour unions, has announced a 24-hour general strike for May 18th. The organisers state that the action is in response to the interception of the latest global Sumud flotilla by Israeli forces near Crete. The flotilla, which comprised 58 small vessels, reportedly included a significant number of Italian nationals on board. The strike is set to affect services and transport across Italy. Train services are expected to face severe disruption from 9 p.m. local time on May 17th. Public transport providers in major cities, including Rome and Milan, have also announced their intention to take part in the strike. Taxi drivers' unions are expected to join as well. Specialized and non-emergency healthcare services are likely to operate with limited availability. In addition, several students and workers' unions have announced demonstrations throughout the day. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Several general strikes have been called in Italy in recent years, largely in response to international political developments, particularly the war in Gaza, and in opposition to the right-wing government of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. These strikes have typically followed notable political events. For example, the last general strike in November 2025 came after the publication of the 2026 state budget. The May 18th strike will highly likely result in major traffic congestion and service disruption. In large cities such as Rome, Milan, Turin, and Naples, the strike will almost certainly lead to intensified road traffic across city centers and along key urban routes, including ring roads. Airport services are unlikely to be directly affected. A separate air traffic controllers strike had been anticipated for May 11th. However, travel to and from airports will likely be disrupted. Blockades on roads connecting airports to city centers remain a realistic possibility. Large-scale protests are likely to take place in city centers. As the strike is directly linked to the war in Gaza, demonstrations are also likely in the vicinity of US and Israeli diplomatic facilities. This will almost certainly lead to heightened security deployments throughout the day. Localized protests are also likely on university campuses and at high schools. There is a realistic possibility that some demonstrations could escalate into clashes between protesters and responding police. As seen during previous general strikes, there is also a possibility that protesters will attempt to blockade facilities they perceive as supporting Israel. This could include seaports or sites owned by defense sector companies. It is likely that, although the intensity of civil unrest will decrease after the May 18th strike, further protest will take place in Italy in the short term. On June 2nd, Italy will mark the 80th anniversary of the proclamation of the Republic in 1946, an occasion that typically coincides with a military parade in Rome. It is likely that limited protests will be organized to coincide with the date. As the June 2nd commemorations are expected to attract a wide range of political groups, isolated confrontations between rival activists cannot be ruled out. In Ukraine, recent ceasefire messaging from Moscow is unlikely to signal a genuine shift towards negotiations, with Russian forces likely preparing for renewed summer offensives. On May 8th, US President Donald Trump announced a 3-day ceasefire covering all kinetic activity between Russia and Ukraine, from May 9th to May 11th, during Russia's Victory Day celebrations. The announcement also included a planned 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner of war exchange. The Victory Day parade, held on May 9th, commemorates the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany and has become a central component of the Putin regime's military-patriotic identity. The event proceeded without a Ukrainian attack. The 2025 Victory Day parade in Moscow was significantly scaled back. No military hardware was displayed, guest numbers were reduced, and numerous smaller regional parades were cancelled. Just hours after declaring in Red Square that victory has always been and will be ours, President Vladimir Putin stated that the war in Ukraine was coming to an end. The 3-day ceasefire was marked by continued limited offensive operations. Unmanned aerial vehicle activity and artillery fire persisted, alongside repeated mutual allegations of violations. However, neither side conducted long-range strikes during the truce. Overnight, on May 13th to 14th, Russian forces launched more than 670 attack drones and decoys, along with 56 missiles, against targets across Ukraine, particularly Kiev. The strikes resulted in at least 4 deaths and 44 injuries. 3 of those killed died when an apartment building in Kiev was struck. Notably, the wave of attacks continued into the daytime, with the total number of attack drones and decoys rising to more than 800. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The ceasefire agreement was preceded by Russian demands for a Victory Day ceasefire, issued under the threat of a retaliatory, massive missile strike against central Kiev. This came amid an escalated Ukrainian deep strike campaign in 2026. The Ukrainian military had highly likely established the conditions necessary to conduct deep strikes against Russia during the proposed ceasefire period. Kiev had earlier unilaterally proposed its own ceasefire for May 5th to 6th, which Russia did not reciprocate. Ukrainian deep strikes, which could have disrupted the Victory Day parade, would almost certainly have represented a significant propaganda victory for Ukrainian forces. It is likely that President Trump's involvement compelled Ukraine to accept the ceasefire proposal. However, the Office of the President of Ukraine almost certainly exploited the situation for propaganda purposes. Its statement declared that the parade in Moscow shall be permitted and listed the exact coordinates of Red Square as exempt from Ukrainian strikes. The scaled-back parade likely undermined Russia's ability to defend its territory against the threat of Ukrainian deep strikes. Putin's comments that the war is coming to an end are likely not indicative of a willingness to negotiate a settlement. He is likely attempting to suggest that Russia is closer to achieving its war aims on the battlefield. This is likely intended to reassure a domestic audience that is becoming increasingly fatigued by the war and concerned about conscription, as well as Ukraine's ability to conduct long-range strikes across much of Russia's territory. Russia's current primary military objective is almost certainly the full occupation of the Donbass. The remaining Ukrainian-held areas of Donetsk Oblast, commonly referred to as Ukraine's fortress belt, have proved highly difficult for Russian forces to advance through without sustaining substantial casualties. In 2025, during the period in which the Trump administration attempted to push through a peace settlement, a critical issue was Russia's demand that Ukrainian forces withdraw from the fortress belt as a precondition for a broader agreement. As recently as May 7th, senior Putin aide Yuri Ushakov continued to insist that Ukrainian forces must withdraw from the unoccupied areas of Donetsk Oblast before Russia would agree to a broad ceasefire and reopen peace negotiations. Withdrawal from the fortress belt is almost certainly a demand Kyiv is unwilling to accept without robust, credible, and enforceable security guarantees against further Russian invasion, given the area's importance to Ukraine's defense. The current operational picture along the front lines is likely unfavorable to Moscow. Reporting indicates that Russia suffered a net loss of 116 square kilometers of controlled territory in April 2026. This marks Russia's first net loss since Ukraine's Kursk incursion in August 2024. Average daily territorial gains have also fallen significantly in 2026, compared with the same period last year. However, the annual Rasputitsa mud season has historically slowed Russian advances. Its usual end in May or June often coincides with an increase in the tempo of Russian ground offensives. Russian forces likely used the ceasefire period to stockpile long-range one-way attack UAVs and missiles. As observed after previous ceasefires, this accumulated stockpile likely enabled the large-scale, layered wave of long-range strikes against Ukrainian cities on May 13th to 14th. The scale of the attacks ranks among the largest conducted by Russia during the entire war. This reflects increased Russian production rates of long-range projectiles since 2025, as well as an established practice of stockpiling long-range munitions during any moratoriums before launching significant strikes. This pattern will likely be observed again following any future temporary ceasefires. Russian forces also likely used the 3-day ceasefire to redeploy units near the front lines, or to conduct reliefs in place in preparation for future ground offensives. It is likely that during summer 2026, Russian forces will attempt significant ground offensives in an effort to encircle the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, the central urban stronghold of the fortress belt. Turning to the Gulf, renewed Iranian attacks in the Strait of Hormuz and further U.S. strikes have increased pressure on the fragile diplomatic track between Washington and Tehran. On May 7th, Iranian forces launched missiles and attack drones at 3 U.S. naval vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command stated that all were successfully intercepted. U.S. forces subsequently conducted strikes against the city of Bandar Abbas and on Keshm Island. CENTCOM said it targeted Iranian launch sites, command centers, and intelligence nodes. The Iranian military accused the United States of violating the ceasefire. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump stated that the ceasefire remains in place despite the attacks. Following the escalation, air defenses were again activated in the United Arab Emirates on May 8th. The Ministry of Defense announced that air defense systems engaged 2 ballistic missiles and 3 attack drones launched from Iran, resulting in 3 injuries. On May 10th, further attacks were recorded in Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar. Kuwaiti authorities reported the detection of an unspecified number of hostile drones. The UAE's Ministry of Defense stated that Emirati air defense systems successfully engaged 2 attack drones launched from Iran. Meanwhile, a bulk carrier was reported to have been struck by a drone in Qatar's territorial waters. On May 10th, Tehran conveyed its response to the US proposed draft agreement. While the specific details are not publicly known, Iranian media report that the demands include an end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, an end to the US naval blockade, the lifting of US sanctions, the release of frozen Iranian assets, war reparations, and Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. The response reportedly made no mention of the nuclear file. US President Donald Trump described the Iranian response as totally unacceptable and reportedly convened a meeting with his national security team on May 11th to discuss next steps, including a potential return to military operations. Speaking to reporters ahead of the meeting, President Trump said that the ceasefire with Iran is on massive life support. 2 US officials subsequently briefed that he is leaning towards a resumption of military action in order to force concessions. On May 11th, US media reported that the United Arab Emirates has secretly participated in the Iran conflict as an active combatant, citing people familiar with the matter. The report highlighted an alleged UAE strike against a refinery on Iran's Lavan Island in the Persian Gulf in early April. No other specific attacks were mentioned. On May 12th, further reports emerged that Saudi Arabia had also launched several strikes against Iran during the conflict, with one source describing them as tit-for-tat strikes. Then, on May 13th, reports indicated that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait had conducted strikes against Iran-backed Shia militias in Iraq during the war. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Since the implementation of a 2-week US-Iran ceasefire on April 8th, the agreement has effectively remained in place, despite not being formally extended, and despite violations in the maritime domain. This has resulted in a significant decrease in the scale and frequency of Iranian attacks across the Middle East. However, escalating disputes over the Strait of Hormuz, alongside competing blockades imposed by the United States and Iran, led to a renewal of Iranian strikes against the UAE on May 4th to 5th. While attacks are not currently being launched on a daily cadence or at the same scale seen prior to April 8th, elevated rates of Iranian strikes have continued, largely targeting the UAE. The UAE has likely been prioritized over other Gulf states for multiple reasons, and Iranian retaliation strikes will likely continue to focus on the UAE in the short term. Emerging reports of the UAE's direct involvement in the conflict as an active combatant against Iran will likely further reinforce its prioritization as a target. Other contributing factors behind the UAE's prioritization as a target by Iran likely include Fujairah's critical role as an oil export terminal that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, thereby reducing Iranian leverage. They also include the UAE's increasingly close security partnership with Israel, further reinforced by recent claims from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he secretly visited the UAE during the war. In addition, the UAE is likely becoming increasingly isolated among the Gulf states. Its rivalry with Saudi Arabia intensified significantly following the failed UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council offensive in Yemen and the subsequent Saudi-backed counteroffensive in December 2025 to January 2026. This dynamic likely culminated in the UAE's recent withdrawal from OPEC. Tehran likely seeks to further isolate the UAE, publicly the most hostile Gulf state towards Iran, from the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council through its prioritized targeting. In doing so, Iran is likely attempting to widen the gap between Riyadh's current de-escalatory approach and Abu Dhabi's more hawkish posture. Reports of Saudi strikes against Iran during the war have likely had the opposite effect to those attributed to the UAE, reducing rather than increasing Iran's willingness to target Saudi territory. Riyadh likely conducted limited, calibrated strikes to restore deterrence. Tehran, in turn, likely views escalation with Saudi Arabia as higher risk, given the kingdom's greater military capacity, strategic depth, and regional influence. Following the reported Saudi strikes against Iran, de-escalation appears to have taken place in the week prior to the April 8 ceasefire implementation. Between March 25 and 31st, 105 projectiles were launched against Saudi Arabia. That figure fell to just over 25 between April 1st and 6th. Moreover, the UAE has effectively severed diplomatic contact with Iran. Saudi Arabia, by contrast, has maintained regular engagement. It is likely that the reported Saudi strikes were followed by diplomatic contacts and an informal agreement to de-escalate. While Riyadh is almost certainly opposed to any potential end state that cedes control of the Strait of Hormuz to Iran, Saudi Arabia has several incentives to promote de-escalation. In a widely publicized recent article in Saudi state-owned media, former Saudi intelligence chief Prince Turki al-Faisal argued the case against the kingdom engaging in a full-scale conflict with Iran despite the Iranian attacks. He stated that Saudi Arabia would not be dragged into the furnace of destruction. A major escalation, he warned, would threaten desalination plants, oil and gas infrastructure, and ultimately the highly valued Vision 2030 initiative, which underpins Riyadh's strategy to diversify the Saudi economy. With the current diplomatic track facing major difficulties, Washington may conclude that a return to conflict is the only viable means of forcing compliance from Tehran. However, such a decision is unlikely to be taken imminently. The United States has redeployed assets, including aerial refueling tankers, to bases that were evacuated before February 28, such as Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. In the event of renewed full-scale conflict, these facilities could be struck by Iran with relative ease. If the United States resumes strikes against Iran in an effort to break the current deadlock, this would highly likely result in renewed full-scale Iranian attacks against targets across the Middle East. Recent leaked classified assessments by U.S. intelligence services indicate that, since the ceasefire, Iran has restored access to 30 of its 33 missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz. It has also regained access to around 90% of its underground missile storage and launch facilities. The assessments further state that Iran still fields between 70 and 75% of its transporter Erector launchers used for ballistic missiles, and retains approximately 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. If accurate, these findings highly likely suggest that despite high-intensity U.S.-Israeli strikes, Iran maintains the capability to conduct large-scale long-range attacks across the Middle East, likely for several more months. In East Africa, opposition-led demonstrations planned in Mogadishu carry a realistic possibility of major unrest and violent clashes with security forces. On May 10th, government forces used live ammunition to disperse anti-government protesters in the Dainile district of Mogadishu. According to witnesses, one Somali citizen was killed and another injured. Protesters reportedly accused the administration of President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud of corruption and land grabbing during the demonstrations. Widespread protests had been planned across Mogadishu on May 10th. They were intended to oppose the alleged forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of residents from neighborhoods in the city and the transfer of land to influential businessmen. The demonstrations were organized by the opposition Somali Future Council, led by figures including former President Sharif Sheikh Ahmed and former Prime Minister Hassan Ali Khaire. While the government-designated Engineer Yarisau Stadium, formerly Banadir Stadium, as the official protest venue, organizers had called for 22 separate protest sites across Mogadishu. The government accused protesters of attempting to paralyze the city and moved to clamp down on the demonstrations. Dozens of Turkish-supplied armored personnel carriers and tanks were deployed at major intersections throughout Mogadishu. In a show of solidarity, Turkey also flew 2 F-16 fighter jets over the city. Opposition leaders in Mogadishu have announced plans for a fresh wave of demonstrations on May 16th. Some opposition figures have warned that supporters would defend themselves if attacked by security forces. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The demonstrations took place against a backdrop of political instability. On March 4, 2026, Somalia's federal parliament approved constitutional amendments that shifted the country towards a model of direct universal suffrage. The changes extended the presidential term limit from 4 to 5 years and postponed the scheduled 2026 general elections until 2027. Plans to hold protests on May 16th, one day after President Mohamud's constitutional mandate was due to expire, almost certainly reflect an attempt by the opposition to broaden the demonstrations into a wider anti-government movement. They are resisting what they describe as an unconstitutional extension of power. This almost certainly increases the possibility that protests will become more widespread, and that security forces will attempt a more severe crackdown. The warning that protesters would defend themselves against the use of force by security forces almost certainly increases the risk of clashes. This posture marks a notable escalation from the May 10th demonstrations and is likely to be interpreted by federal authorities as justification for a more robust security deployment. Should protesters clash with security forces, they will highly likely face severe crackdowns, including the use of live ammunition, tear gas, and mass arrests. This response could quell unrest, driven by fear of being targeted by security forces. Alternatively, it could exacerbate demonstrations as protesters mobilize against what they perceive to be abuses of power. Major clashes in Somalia have previously followed perceived abuses of power. In February 2021, large-scale protests erupted after President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed, known as Farmajo, failed to step down when his term expired on February 8th. On February 19th, security forces opened fire on hundreds of demonstrators marching along the main airport road in support of opposition presidential candidates, including former Prime Minister Kerry. On April 12th, Parliament approved a 2-year extension of Farmajo's term. This triggered armed confrontations in Mogadishu between government forces and pro-opposition elements, primarily from Hirshabelle. The Somali National Army subsequently fractured, as some units defected to the opposition. An estimated 200,000 civilians were displaced from Mogadishu as a result. Facing sustained domestic and international pressure, Farmajo rescinded the extension on April 27th and agreed to a dialogue process. That process ultimately enabled the delayed elections that brought Hassan Sheikh Mohamud to power in May 2022. High tensions between Mogadishu and several federal member states that oppose the constitutional amendments almost certainly increase the risk that major demonstrations could spiral into internal armed conflict. Puntland withdrew recognition from the federal government in March 2024. Jubaland suspended ties in November 2024, and Southwest State halted cooperation with Mogadishu. Clashes have already taken place between federal forces and those of Jubaland and Southwest State. In the event of large-scale confrontations between security forces and protesters, federal member states opposed to Mogadishu could seek to exploit the unrest to increase pressure on the federal government. This could include political support for protesters, the mobilization of allied forces, or limited military action. Also in Central Africa, retaliatory violence is highly likely following a major Codeco attack in Ituri province that killed at least 69 people. On May 9th, it was reported that armed men affiliated with the ethnically Lendu Cooperative for the Development of Congo, or Codeco, killed at least 69 people in Ituri province in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo on April 28th. The attacks reportedly took place across several villages. The dead included 19 militia members and soldiers. Several sets of remains have yet to be recovered, as the sustained presence of Codeco fighters has prevented access to the affected villages. The non-profit NT Association, which represents the Hema community, described the killings as a massacre. The attacks followed an earlier assault on the same day by the Ethnically Hema Convention for the Popular Revolution, or CRP, against positions held by the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, known as FARDC, near Pimbo. The United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC, MONUSCO, stated that it rescued 191 people in the aftermath of the attack. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The Ituri conflict has seen a resurgence since 2017, following the death of a Lendu priest during his stay at the presbytery of the Bahema abbots in Droro. Some Lendu members accused the Hema of being responsible, alleging it was part of a broader plan to exterminate their leaders. The conflict has escalated further over the past year. On March 31, 2025, former convicted war criminal Thomas Lubanga announced the creation of the CRP. Since July, the CRP has repeatedly targeted FARDC positions and civilian sites across Ituri. Jugu territory has experienced some of the worst CRP violence. It was one of the principal theaters of Hema-Lendu fighting during the 1999 to 2003 Ituri War, and remains a region where Codeco maintains a strong operational footprint. At the same time, Codeco and affiliated militias have intensified attacks on Hema farming communities and camps for displaced persons in Jugu and Irumu territories. The conflict is largely rooted in disputes over land use. The Hema are typically a more pastoralist community, while the Lendu are predominantly agricultural. Under land legislation introduced during the presidency of Mobutu, wealthier or better connected actors were able to obtain legal title to land, in some cases over areas already occupied or cultivated by others. This reinforced Lendu claims that Hema elites were using state law and patronage networks to dispossess them of their land. During Uganda's occupation from 1998 to 2003, Ugandan soldiers provided arms and military training to different ethnic groups. This likely transformed what had been a localized land dispute into a broader ethnic conflict. The government has struggled to quell the violence in Ituri. Its response has largely been military, centered on FARDC operations, MONUSCO deployments, and ad hoc peace agreements. In 2021, the Congolese government declared the region to be in a state of siege. That measure has been repeatedly renewed. Since early 2025, the resurgence of the AFCM-23 insurgency in North Kivu and South Kivu has overstretched the FARDC. This has almost certainly reduced its capacity to contain violence in Ituri. The conflict environment in Ituri is also highly fragmented, with around 20 armed groups operating across the province. This complicates efforts to negotiate and enforce durable peace agreements. Moreover, militias are embedded within local security and economic systems. For many civilians, they provide protection against rival groups, fill security gaps left by a weak state presence, and offer access to income and livelihoods. Amid a surge in Codeco and CRP violence, further attacks in Ituri are highly likely. Civilians are likely to comprise the majority of casualties and to be most affected by the conflict. According to the United Nations, around 1.5 million people in Ituri are experiencing food insecurity. Many also face significant barriers to healthcare. Medical facilities have been attacked and looted, and numerous centers are operating with shortages of supplies and a lack of essential equipment. The April 28th Codeco attack is highly likely to provoke retaliation by the CRP, further escalating the conflict in the region. And in South Africa, widespread flooding is likely to overwhelm local infrastructure and increase the risk of waterborne disease outbreaks. Heavy rainfall and flooding have severely affected the Eastern and Western Cape provinces, killing at least 10 people and displacing thousands. On May 11th, the central government declared the flooding a national disaster across the Western Cape, Northwest, Free State, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, and Mpumalanga provinces. On May 7th, authorities in Cuba municipality in the Eastern Cape advised evacuations from low-lying areas as flood risks increased and the Mpofu Dam overflowed for the first time in 11 years. Flooding in Nelson Mandela Bay left shelters overcrowded, with more than 2,000 people displaced. Businesses in Bakkens Valley, Causton, Neve, and North End were also affected. Roads across the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro remained flooded and inaccessible, and burials at local cemeteries were suspended on May 8th. Major roads in the Cuba region, including the route between Oyster Bay and Humansdorp, remained blocked by floodwaters. In the Western Cape, the Weather Service's Orange Level 8 warning prompted evacuations at Nature's Valley Camp on May 7th. Heavy rainfall around the Cape Peninsula led to uprooted trees and flooded roads. Multiple schools, including Beaumont Primary in Somerset West, were damaged by severe weather on May 11th. Authorities in Cape Town urged residents to remain at home. They reported storm damage and minor flooding and confirmed a water outage in Wynberg. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The flooding will highly likely result in significant secondary impacts across the affected regions. In the short term, it is highly likely to exacerbate displacement. In Cape Town alone, more than 10,000 structures across 26 informal settlements have been affected. This will highly likely increase pressure on local hospitals, humanitarian organizations, and emergency responders as they work to provide temporary shelter, blankets, food parcels, hygiene kits, and sanitation support. These challenges will almost certainly be compounded by reduced access caused by flooded roads, mudslides, and damaged bridges. That disruption will constrain response efforts and may cut some communities off from assistance altogether. In the medium term, there is an elevated risk of waterborne disease. Floodwater is likely to contaminate drinking supplies, cause sewage systems to overflow, and increase overcrowding in shelters as displacement continues. These conditions heighten the risk of communicable disease transmission. In April, South Africa's National Institute for Communicable Diseases issued flood health guidance, warning that floodwaters and overcrowded temporary living conditions can increase disease risk, particularly following heavy rainfall and disruptions to water and sanitation services. In February 2026, the World Health Organization warned that cholera cases in southern Africa had risen sharply following flooding across multiple countries. It assessed that the wider regional environment is becoming increasingly vulnerable to waterborne disease outbreaks. The report also stated that southern Africa is entering a critical risk period between March and August. The WHO projected a significant rise in cholera cases across the region, driven by flooding, displacement, and disruptions to water and sanitation services. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, a major militant attack in Pakistan's Bannu district may further undermine already fragile peace talks with Afghanistan. On May 9th, militants associated with Ittihadul Mujahideen Pakistan, or IMP, carried out an attack on a Pakistani police post in Bannu district in the northwestern border province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. According to available reports, the assault began with a suicide vehicle-borne improvised explosive device and was followed by a coordinated attack using small arms fire. The militants also reportedly ambushed police units approaching the base to provide reinforcements. At least 21 police officers were killed, and an unspecified number of civilians were injured. Pakistani authorities have claimed that the attack was linked to the Afghan Taliban, an allegation the Taliban rejected on May 12th. Pakistani and Afghan officials have been engaged in China-brokered talks aimed at resolving the ongoing border conflict between the two countries. So far, these efforts have been largely unsuccessful. The most recent round of negotiations took place in the Chinese city of Urumqi between April 1st and April 7th. Now our intelligence team's assessment. IMP is a newly formed group established in April 2025. It was reportedly created by three splinter factions of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Hafiz Gul Bahadur Group, Lashkar-e-Islam, and the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Harkat-Inqilab-e-Islami Pakistan. Following its formation, IMP launched a large-scale media campaign in multiple languages, including Urdu, Pashto, and English. This was likely intended both to strengthen its propaganda efforts and to cultivate a degree of international legitimacy. TTP channels have largely refrained from directly addressing the new group. However, after IMP's announcement, they published messages emphasizing the importance of unity in the struggle against Pakistani authorities. At present, the scope and dynamics of the relationship between IMP and TTP remain difficult to assess, given limited reporting and IMP's recent emergence. Nonetheless, it appears likely that the two groups retain links and possibly some level of coordination as they share objectives, operational theaters, and likely personnel networks. The sophistication of the attack is likely to be interpreted by Islamabad as evidence of orchestration by the Afghan Taliban. There is a realistic possibility that it will negatively affect potential peace talks. Despite some tentative signs of détente, trust between the two sides remains fragile. There have been reports that TTP leaders were ordered to relocate from Kabul following Chinese and Pakistani complaints about the Taliban's hosting of senior TTP figures in the Afghan capital. Even so, negotiations have continued to be undermined by persistent mistrust and ongoing violence in border areas. The Afghanistan-Pakistan border regions remain weakly governed and almost certainly continue to provide a permissive operating environment for Islamist militant groups, including factions not aligned with the Taliban authorities in Kabul. Many of these groups likely view sustained tensions as being in their interest, as this creates greater operational space and recruitment opportunities. IMP will highly likely continue to opportunistically target Pakistani security forces in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And finally, protests and political violence continue in India's West Bengal state, following a highly contested regional election. Large-scale protests erupted after the Bharatiya Janata Party, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, secured victory in the state elections held on May 4th. Following the result, the leader of the defeated Trinamool Congress, Mamata Banerjee, refused to resign, denying that she had lost the vote. Protests began during the vote-counting process, with several party offices vandalized, and continued throughout the following week. On May 7th, 2 people were injured in a bomb attack in Howrah, which took place amid clashes between opposing BJP and TMC supporters. At least 6 people are suspected to have been killed in the unrest so far, with hundreds more injured or arrested. Representatives of both parties have accused their opponents of sponsoring targeted political assassinations in the aftermath of the vote. On May 7th, the governor of West Bengal forcibly dissolved the Banerjee cabinet, clearing the way for the new chief minister, Suvendu Adhikari, to take office on May 9th. Now our intelligence team's assessment. West Bengal is located in northeastern India and shares a border with Bangladesh. The May 4th vote marked the first time the BJP secured control of the state, ending 15 years of Trinamool Congress rule. The party won nearly 46% of the vote, a sharp increase from the 10% it secured in 2016. In addition to the unprecedented outcome, the protests were almost certainly also driven by pre-electoral reforms introduced by the Indian government, which opposition figures argue heavily skewed the vote in favor of Modi's party. In 2025, the Election Commission of India implemented a special intensive revision, or SIR, of electoral rolls in several states. The process was intended to remove duplicate, irregular, or deceased voters from the rolls. In West Bengal, the SIR exercise flagged and removed 9 million voters, amounting to around 12% of the electorate. Given the large population of Bangladeshi migrant workers in the state, a significant proportion of those affected were Muslim voters. This development almost certainly played in favor of the BJP, whose electoral base is predominantly Hindu. The unrest that followed the results is also likely linked to pre-existing high levels of polarization and sectarian tension in West Bengal. Over the past decade, the state has experienced several waves of religiously motivated mob violence, often involving Hindu and Muslim communities. In 2017, dozens of people were injured, and one person was killed during clashes in the Basirhat area, sparked by the circulation of a cartoon deemed insulting to Islam. Further clashes were recorded between 2021 and 2024. Tensions were particularly acute in districts bordering Bangladesh, where there is a higher proportion of Muslim residents. Some local commentators have observed that the growth in sectarian tensions has been both leveraged and fueled by the BJP. The party has campaigned on claims that West Bengal's Hindu population is under threat from a growing Muslim community, largely of Bangladeshi origin. Further large-scale protests are unlikely in the immediate term, following the completion of the state government transition. However, isolated incidents of political violence involving protesters and party activists cannot be ruled out. Cyclical protests also remain possible in response to proposed or implemented reforms by the new BJP administration, which has already pledged to introduce land management reforms aimed at boosting manufacturing output. Since recording poor results in the 2024 general elections, where it lost its parliamentary majority, the BJP has secured several significant victories in state-level polls. These wins have likely provided renewed momentum for Modi's government. The elections in West Bengal have a realistic possibility of implications beyond India. The state government has historically coordinated closely with Bangladesh on issues such as border management and riverine rights. This has included overseeing the implementation of the 1996 Ganges Water Sharing Treaty, which is due to expire in 2026. The July 2024 revolution in Bangladesh, which significantly destabilized the country, also had repercussions along the West Bengal border. It led to increased flows of irregular migrants and consequently a rise in violent encounters between migrants and India's border security force. In 2025, these incidents resulted in 34 deaths, the highest figure in 5 years. Whereas the Trinamool Congress government positioned itself as a relatively moderate partner, a future BJP administration could adopt a more assertive stance in border areas. It is likely to strengthen border control measures, including the use of so-called pushback operations. If a BJP government in West Bengal leads to reduced cross-border cooperation and heightened tensions between local Bangladeshi and Indian authorities, this could place further strain on Dhaka-Delhi relations, which have reached a recent nadir following the 2024 revolution. Leaders of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party have expressed surprise at the scale of the Trinamool Congress defeat. Protests have been staged in Dhaka, calling for Mamata Banerjee's reinstatement, and several Bangladeshi MPs have warned of the potential mass deportation of undocumented Bangladeshis from West Bengal. Given the significant community overlap across the India-Bangladesh border, any perceived targeting of Muslim communities or undocumented migrants is likely to resonate strongly in Bangladesh. This increases the risk of diplomatic friction, further protests, and potentially the targeting of Hindu communities in response. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.